Hello and welcome to another episode of Im Gespräch mit. Today we are talking to James Bradley, who is joining us from Sydney, Australia. James is a novelist and a critic, and he is the author of Clade, a climate fiction novel that was first published in 2015 and which has just come out as a Clade edition, which means it has lots of annotations and additional material. With us are also my colleague Hanna Maria Vesta, who is the editor, and Stefanie Schneer, who is a teacher and has written the annotations and is currently writing the teacher's guide together with Julia Huber. My name is Brigitte Briggs. I organize webinars, and I'd like to welcome Steffi, Hanna, and James. James, would you like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, as you can probably guess from my voice, I'm Australian. I am an author, a novelist, and essayist mostly. I've written 5 novels for adults, a book called Rack, a book called The Deep Field, The Resurrectionist, Clade, and a novel called Ghost Species, which came out in 2020. I also write. I've also written a couple of novels for young adults, and I've published a book of poetry, and I edited the Penguin Book of the Ocean a few years ago. And I write a lot of nonfiction as well. For years, I've done a lot of reviewing and criticism, and more recently, I've been writing a lot of nonfiction, kind of in that kind of environmental space. So I've written a lot of essays around environmental history and climate change and questions of that. And I've got a big book coming out next year in 2024 called Deep Water, which is a non-fiction book about the ocean.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. And what made you, excuse me, and what made you want to write this book in particular? How did you get the idea for Clade?
Yeah, so I started Clade probably about 10 years ago now, so in about 2011 or 2012. And at that point, I knew I wanted to write about climate change, but I didn't know how to do it because there wasn't much around about climate change at that point. Difficult subject to write about. I mean, the problem is because it kind of touches everything, as soon as you're trying to write a story about it, it rapidly kind of spirals out of control and you end up writing a book about everything. So what I did with Clade was kind of turn that around and try and write a book which was a much narrower focus. So instead of trying to write a book about everything, I tried to write a book which was really focused in on this family, kind of moving through time and looking at that. But I think what I actually wanted to do was I'd got into this thing where whenever I thought about climate change and whenever I tried to imagine what the world was going to be like in 50 years or 100 years, you know, when my kids grew up, say, I'd find I couldn't. I'd find I had no way, like I had no ability to imagine that. And so one of the things I actually did with the book, I think, was to try and imagine that process in a kind of practical way. Like what will it be like to live through that process? What will happen? What will the kind of emotional and physical experience of living through those changes be? And so the book, I think, kind of grew out of that at some level. I wanted to think about what it would be like, where we were going to end up, and to try and imagine what the world might be like when it had gone through those transformations. And in an odd kind of way, that was really helpful because what it did was, in a sense, the thing that you've imagined is always less dreadful than the thing you can't imagine. Does that make sense? There's something about making it concrete that made it easier to think about and to try and work out what I thought about it.
Yeah, and is the book in any way autobiographical? And if yes, also.
Yeah, look, so yes, I mean, in the sense that all books are autobiographical, not in a narrow sense. So none of the characters and the situations, things aren't lifted from my life or anything like that. But a lot of the stuff about the family dynamics are, you know, kind of based on dynamics that I'm, you know, that are ones I know from my own family and from my own children and things like that. And the character of Noah in particular, who's one of the characters, is kind of drawn from a family member and from, I guess, spending time with the child of a friend of mine who's on the spectrum. So it was very much that character, I guess, has some kind of foundation in people that I knew or know.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. And you've also mentioned climate change already. And are there any specific scientific resources that you've been using in order to research anything for your book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So when I was writing it, I read a lot around the subject, and what I was trying to do was to actually say, where will we be in 2040? Where will we be in 2050? And to try and think about some of the things that would happen. So, I mean, I read a lot of materials around it. I read some of the IPCC stuff. I read journalism. So I read a lot of stuff, but I don't know that I was drilling down to real specifics, because I felt like, in a sense, there's so many unknowns. You can kind of make things up. And I mean, we're seeing that now. I mean, we're already seeing effects that you couldn't have predicted kind of happening around us. So yeah, so I mean, I drew on a number of things, and I tried, I guess, I didn't have sea levels suddenly rising 500 meters. Do you know what I mean? So I wanted to have a degree of kind of scientific plausibility around it, but I didn't also, at the same time, I wasn't trying to make it a kind of granular scientific faction, if that makes sense. It wasn't intended to be a kind of textbook.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't read like that. You've mentioned specifics. It's very interesting that you basically predicted a pandemic. Why did you choose to include a pandemic? And was it sort of scary to see what you'd written on the page see come to life?
So the other thing to say about there being a pandemic is it starts in China, and people believe that it was natural. They start saying, oh, look, it's been made in a lab, and there's a whole lot of kind of paranoia around it, and that's all in the book. So when it all happened, that was really very strange. Look, I put it there because it was one of those things that I'd read quite a lot about pandemics, and they seemed like a very reasonable thing. There's a lot of science suggesting that as we push further and further into kind of the habitats of animals and push them into smaller and smaller and more fragmented habitats, you're going to get a lot more of that kind of zoonotic transfer out of animal species. I mean, it seemed to me like something that was likely to happen. But that sense of it happening, one of the things that's really disconcerting about writing in this climate space is that reality keeps overtaking what you're writing. So you'll write things that you think are 10 years away or 20 years away, or that you just make up. And by the time the book comes out, or shortly after the book comes out, they start happening. And this wasn't a climate effect in a sense, but it was very much that feeling that kind of reality was overtaking the fiction. So in the book, towards the end, there's a bit where the planet's Earth's orbit has started to wobble slightly, and the magnetic fields look like they might flip. And I made that up. Like, I just made it up. I said, well, maybe if the ice melts, the planet will be weighted differently. That's now happening. So that kind of sense, there's something quite disconcerting when you're thinking about climate change, to be producing things that you think are science fiction and then end up being real within a few years.
Maybe you should stop writing books. No, I'm just kidding. Some critics.
When the pandemic happened, I definitely thought
that. Okay, thank you. You mentioned already where you got the idea for Noah, that you have someone that inspired that figure. We were wondering why you add autism as a defining feature for Noah, as we had the feeling that the characters have quite a lot on their plates already, let's say. So how come that you added that?
So I don't know that it was a conscious decision, to be honest. I think when I was putting the book together, he just arrived like that. So I wrote some early sections, and he was in one of them, and that was how he was. But one thing, weird way, he's the character in the book that I cared about the most. Does that make sense? Like, he And I wanted very much for him to be, to have his own arc. Like, I didn't want him to be defined by being on the spectrum. I wanted him to be someone who, he's a person. Like, things happen to him, he changes. So I very much wanted that sense that he is more than that diagnosis. Does that make sense in a fictional sense? Like, so he is someone who has this kind of arc through the novel. But no, I think he just arrived like that. I don't think I was trying to. I, I don't think it was one of those things where I thought it would be interesting that I did that. I think when the character kind of arrived on the page, that's what he was like. And as I say, he's very much drawn from a couple of people I know, so, and people that I kind of care about. So, I mean, he was someone I cared about very much when I was writing him.
And I mean, your characters learn to deal with all sorts of things. They manage whatever comes their way, really, in such trying times, which made us wonder, is your vision of the future rather pessimistic or optimistic, and why?
Look, I think it's actually optimistic. I mean, I think that what I'd say is I don't think despair is an option, if that makes sense. I think particularly have children. Like, I don't think if you have children, despair is an option. There's a kind of flaw that they put on. There's a flaw that they put on your capacity for that. You have to think that there's a future. What I would say is that there's a great line where Gramsci, the Marxist, talks about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And what he means by that is you have to be kind of ruthlessly realistic about where you are, but simultaneously always believe in kind of human possibility and the capacity of people to kind of come through and make things. And that always seems to me to be quite a useful formulation. Like, we need to start by acknowledging, where we are, what the situation is like. I mean, things are clearly not good in Europe at the moment, and we need to be realistic about what that means, what it's going to be like going forward. And I mean, and the other thing is, every time there's a summer like the one you're having there at the moment, it's not just that it's the hottest summer on record, it's probably the coolest summer we're going to have for the next 100 years. So I mean, there's this kind of sense that this isn't where we're not there yet. Like, it's going to get worse. And so I think you need to be realistic about that. You need to be realistic about what the challenges are, but simultaneously you need to recognize that change is possible. I mean, societies are adaptive systems. Like, that, it's not going to stay the same. And there will be change because there has to be change. Like, societies respond to the stresses that are put upon them. And so, I think that makes me optimistic, that sense that there is change happening already, there will be more change. And I guess there's that sense also that when you think about kind of hope in the future, that it's an active process. It's not something about a kind of abstract feeling. It's about saying, well, these are the things we can do that will get us to something better. So, yeah, I mean, I think I am optimistic now saying all of that.
And talking about change, do you think adaptability is something we need for a hopeful future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think I guess at a kind of policy level, adaptation is now a really big part of what we have to do. I mean, there is so much change already locked in that whatever happens from this point, adaptation has to be a big part of it. And that's going to be huge. And, I mean, it's going to be about building cities that can deal with heat, building cities that can deal with salt water invading their sewage systems. I mean, like huge amounts of kind of adaptation. In Australia, we have enormous problem with fire. We have big problems with flood. I mean, kind of equipping communities to deal with that. That's a really big job. But you also need a kind of adaptability at a personal level, I think. I mean, I think there's a kind of sense that we need to recognize that lots of the things around us that we think are permanent aren't permanent and aren't going to stay. Lots of things are going to unravel. Lots of things are going to change, and a lot of that's going to be, some of it will be great, some of it will be really frightening, and we need to kind of learn to rely on each other while that's happening, and to kind of build those bonds of community around ourselves, because that's how you get through. I guess adaptation is very much about finding those connections, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And briefly returning to the topic of hope, what to use the most hopeful scene in the book?
I think the most hopeful scene in the book's the last one, when they're on the beach. I mean, then they're on that beach at the end, and it's 70 or 80 years after the book began, and the world is utterly transformed, and in bad ways as well as good, but there are still people there. There's still, there's young people growing up. There's young people for whom the world is new. I wanted that sense that however much change there is, there's always something else on the other side, and that kind of sense that whatever happens today, we all wake up tomorrow and have to look at that. So, I mean, that was a deliberately, I'm not sure hope is quite the right word, but it's meant to be a scene that's about possibility. And I think, when you're thinking about hope as that kind of more, not a kind of bland, like I talked before about a kind of abstract thing, but you think about hope as a kind of investment in the future, I think that possibility is a big part of that, and that seems very much about that.
Everything flows and nothing abides. Yeah.
There you are. Yes, absolutely.
Would you agree with the statement that the world in your book is pretty messed up?
Yes, and it is, and it gets progressively more and more messed up, and that's part of what the book's about that kind of gradually escalating process of breakdown. But simultaneously, you see the societies kind of adapting and changing, and people trying to deal with that, I think, as the book proceeds.
Yeah. And talking about these habits, we were wondering, in your book, people still go on vacation, they fly, they rent cars, etc. Did you consider also changing some of these habits?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I suspect if I was writing the book now, some of that stuff would be different. I mean, it's one thing to remember, this book was written about 10 years ago. So some of that stuff, I think perhaps we've reached different positions on it now. I mean, I suspect, international flights are something that are likely to become expensive and difficult fairly quickly. Do you think also, there will be lots of change, but people's lives, people will still go on holidays. Do you know what I mean? People will still, they'll have jobs. There'll be things that's all going to change, obviously, but I do think that there's a kind of continuity to kind of human behavior and human kind of relationships which will go through. So, I mean, yes, perhaps you'd be using a shared electric driverless car. Actually, I think the car in the book is driverless. But yes, I mean, I think what the book doesn't necessarily show, and I might show now, are some of the kind of social arrangements around those things. Does that make sense? So cars would all be shared and will all be shared, I suspect. There'll probably still be individual cars of some kind in 30 or 40 years, but they'll be, we'll be using them very differently, I think.
So the message basically is, no matter how bad it gets, we'll adjust somehow, make the best out of it. And after all, we're just a blink.
Yeah, I suppose. There is something about that kind of deep time perspective, that kind of sense that once you start thinking about the scale of time, one of the things it can do to you is you get into a thing where you just go, well, in the end, we're all dead anyway. Nothing means anything. But I actually think that's the wrong way to think about it. I mean, if you talk to I was talking to an Indigenous academic in Australia a week or two ago, and she was in fact talking about exactly this and saying one of the things you have with those cultures which have very long temporal horizons, they have memories that stretch back 4,000, 5,000, 8,000 years, you know, is this sense that the depth of time actually places you in a position of care and responsibility to both the past and the future. Does that make sense? So depth of time kind of makes you have to think about, what kind of ancestor am I? What are my actions going to do to people 300 years from now in a way that you don't have to think about if you're only thinking in a much smaller frame. So yeah, I think there's a couple of ways of doing that kind of deep time or large perspective. And one of them is nothing really means anything. It's all just transient. But I think the other one is to say what it does is it makes us have to think about how do our actions relate to people in the distant future? What is our connection to the deep past? There's a series of kind of questions like that. And I think that's one of the things the book's trying to get at.
Like in all the chapters, you chose like a short story beginning, sometimes leaving the reader kind of confused, like who is talking, where are we, what time is it? Why did you choose to do that?
So when I started the book, one of the things I really wanted to do was to write like lots of it's left out. Does that make sense? So there's big gaps between the sections, and they, you kind of pick up sometimes 10 years later and a lot's changed. And that was really deliberate. I wanted a book where it felt like lots of the action was happening in the background, if that makes sense. But it was also that I wanted to, when it came out, some people kind of said, "Oh, it's a collection of stories." No, it's not a collection of stories; it's a novel. Do you know what I mean? And what I wanted was all of the. You've got these kind of motifs and ideas that kind of recur. So, kind of missing children, missing parents. There's various ideas that kind of bounce around inside the book, and they kind of tie it together. But yeah, I mean, I think I wanted that sense that each time it began again, it was quite striking and new. Does that make sense? But that it often moved quite a long time onwards. Yeah, I don't know that I meant it to be disorienting.
I think this disorientation, as you call it, that reflects very well what the characters sometimes go through. So it matches.
Yeah. Well, and I do think the disorientation is one of the, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think disorientation is one of the things the book's about as well. That kind of sense that, what's happening to them is disorienting, and that the world is, they're trying to navigate a world that's changed in a whole lot of ways. But yeah, I did want a book, where quite a lot of it was missing. Does that make sense? Because I wanted to do something that covered quite a long span of time. I always really love books that have a kind of geological time span. Does that make sense? And so the book does that thing where as you get towards the last few sections, like the time frame starts to move out. So they're sending that signal out that's going to take, I can't remember, it's 1,000 years or something for them to hear back. But you have this sense that time is kind of opening up ahead of it. And that was kind of what I was talking about before, about that idea of the book's about kind of depth of time and possibility. Because once you start thinking about that kind of deep future, I think it changes our relationship to the present. Does that make sense? It kind of lets you see that all kinds of things can change, So yeah. That was, I think that's what I was trying to do.
And talking about the message, so to say, what would your advice be to students who are afraid of the climate crisis, for example, and its consequences, because that's what we often see in classrooms today. And what would you like these students to take home from your book?
Well, look, the first thing I'd say is it's okay to be frightened, because it's frightening. Like, it is frightening. It's scary and it's hard, and that, those feelings are valid and they're real and they're perfectly reasonable in the situation. The other thing I would say is that the fact that things are scary doesn't mean that they're inevitable. Does that make sense? Like that, the fact that they're scary doesn't mean that we're necessarily heading towards collapse, that we're necessarily heading towards, disaster. We are already, the action that has already been taken has reduced where the temperatures are going already, and that is going to continue to happen. It's not fast enough, it's not far enough, but it is coming down, and that's good. The projections are coming down. But I also think the thing that I would say is that one of the things that the society we live in does to us is it disempowers us in a series of ways. What it says is either there's no point doing anything because you can't fix everything, which seems to me to be the wrong way to think about it. No one can fix everything. You can fix the thing that you know how to fix, and that's the thing that you should do, work out what you can fix. But the other thing I'd say is that we get taught that the only kind of agency we have is as consumers. So it's like, invest your money in that, invest your retirement savings in green things over there, drive an electric car, buy goods that have low carbon miles. I mean, all of that kind of thing. And that's all great. You should do all of that. But we're not just consumers, we're citizens. And we need to engage as citizens. That means voting, that means working together, that means joining organizations, that means becoming kind of active in that way, and not thinking to yourself that, the only kind of forum open to you is social media and purchasing decisions, because that just feeds into the kind of power of the corporations. If you engage and act at a kind of social level and as a citizen, that's how you make things happen. So, I mean, I think that's the first thing I'd say. And the other thing, one more thing I'd say is that I think I wanted the book to be, when you asked about the book's message, I think the book's message was always about trying to create a space of political possibility. What I wanted to do was to say, we think that nothing can change, but when we look at the deep future, we see that everything's going to change. And that means that all of these things that we think are so permanent and unchangeable are actually social constructions that can be altered. Change can come. There's a wonderful, wonderful quote. Ursula Le Guin, not long before she died, gave a speech, and she said, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. And she said, any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. I always loved that idea of just reminding us that things that seem so utterly permanent can be altered, and I think that's what I would like people to take away from the book: possibility, political possibility, and change.
In our discussions, Julia's and mine's, while working with your book, we were sometimes wondering whether we as teachers would be able to handle possible emotional reactions to the book, right? This, I don't know, despair or fear, whatever. Do you have any advice for teachers dealing with important and difficult topics like these?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are difficult, like I said before. I mean, I find them difficult. I spend my time working in this space and I find them difficult. I think anyone who spends time with this knows that there's, compartmentalization is a very powerful tool. But I always think that people's reactions to climate stuff is a bit like grief. Like there's that argument with grief, you kind of go through stages. So you begin in denial, and then you move on to kind of anger, and then you have bargaining, and then you kind of reach a kind of acceptance. And I just think dealing with these kind of climate things is a bit like that. Like people start out and they don't want to know, it's too scary, it's too hard. Then they start trying to kind of work out what, maybe it's not going to be that bad, maybe, you know what I mean? Like, and eventually there's a kind of space you reach past that. But I think that along the way, lots of people behave quite badly about it. Like, and I think particularly, people get into a thing where there's a particular mode, it's mostly men, but they get into a thing where they go, I'm the only one who's brave enough and tough enough to see that everything's useless. There's no point trying to change anything. We're on a highway to disaster that we can't turn around. And I think that that's not a very useful response. Um, and I think there's a lot of kind of sadness that you have to kind of deal with. But I mean, I'd kind of go back to what I said before, which is that the way you get through that stuff is by supporting each other, you know, and by thinking about what to do, how do we do this? How do we make agency for ourselves? And so certainly one of the things I think about a lot in Australia, is an extractive fossil fuel. I mean, we dig up vast amounts of coal, we produce vast amounts of gas. We spend our time exporting climate change to the world, and one of the things that makes that possible is the capture of our government by the fossil fuel industry. And that kind of power over government is exerted in various ways. But there's stuff you can actually do around that about, getting rid of political donations, dealing with lobbyists and stuff like that. So I think it's really useful to identify practical things that you can do that will have an effect, if that makes sense. So I suspect if I was dealing with students, that's what I'd be thinking about trying to move them to a point where they're talking about what can we do, because doing something is always better than doing nothing. And it is the way that you make yourself feel. I talked before about hope being an active practice. I think hope is an active practice, and it comes out of thinking about what to do, but it's about identifying what you want to do to move forward.
Okay, so this positive note is what you would like to see happening in classrooms when working with your book, or is there?
I mean, I think there's. Sorry, I'm speaking over you, but I mean, I think the thing that is important is what I said before. I think it's important to acknowledge that those feelings are real and that they are common and legitimate and completely normal. And I'm not surprised that people feel like that. I feel like that. And I mean, anyone who works around climate changes, you may all have had the same experience where you'll be at a social event and you'll actually talk about the stuff that you're working on and the whole room will go silent. And you're kind of like, yeah, I probably shouldn't have talked about that. But I do think that it's frightening, and I think that acknowledging that that's the case is that. But I think what I would like to see people start thinking about is what are the things we can do that will actually make a difference? Is it, let's get everyone in our school to write to our local member of parliament, or like what are the things? Join up, do stuff, like, because that's how you get there. What are the practical steps towards this? And then that might just be, I have quite a lot of time for the kind of Extinction Rebellion people a few years ago who were just getting in the way, and the throwing of soup on paintings and things, which it seemed to me to be quite a useful thing to be doing, because at least it was making people deal with what was going on, and it was annoying people, but it was making that conversation have to happen, and there's a level at which, I also understand why they were doing it. I mean, you'd listen to people saying, well, why are you doing this? Shouldn't you be doing more practical things? Which the answer is, well, if you know what these practical things are, tell us. But yeah, I mean, I think it's about trying to think through what a strategy for emergency is, if that makes sense.
Okay. Talking about changes or things happening now, looking back at the book, you said already that you started like 10 years ago. If you were to write it again, are there any details you would change now with today's knowledge?
I'd have to move the pandemic to the beginning of the book. That would be the first thing. Or maybe that's just a later pandemic. Yeah, look, I think I'd probably write more about extreme heat, which I think was probably not something I'd thought about very much. Like in the book, it gets hot, but that sense of just these walls of terrible heat, which we're getting in Australia and you're getting in Europe and in North America and across Asia, I don't think that's something that's represented well enough in the book. And I think I would probably want to think, I think one of the things that's been really fascinating over the last few years is seeing the rise of the far right. And I think that is intimately tied up with, in many places, with the kind of fossil fuel industry and with climate denial. Like, I mean, that kind of convergence of those things seems to me to be a really interesting thing, and it's not something I think that I thought about in the book. I mean, the flip side of that is I'd say the thing I think the book does get right, which I'm quite interested by, is when I wrote it, I didn't want to write a book which was about there is a climate disaster. So there are disasters within the book, but what I wanted to capture was that sense of incremental breakdown, the kind of fraying of things. And I think that's something that you can already see happening around us. I've got a friend who lives up in Brisbane, and they had terrible floods in Brisbane about 10 years ago. And she said, after those floods, 6 months later, everyone was back in their houses. Everything was fixed. All the insurance payments had been done. It was all under control. They've had 2 huge rounds of floods in the last 2 years. And she was saying last time I was up there, it's like 9 months, half our streets still not in their houses. So that kind of sense that things are just sitting on top of each other. Further down the coast from us, there were terrible bushfires. People lost their homes. Then there were floods and more people lost their homes. A lot of people, it's 3 years later, a lot of people are still living in tents and temporary accommodation because there aren't enough builders to build new houses. So that kind of sense of the way things build on each other was something that I think the book did do, which I'm kind of glad about, because I think that's one of the things it captures quite well.
And do you have any final remark or message to your readers, which in our case is teachers and students?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say don't despair. Like, however bad things are, don't despair. I would say that, the next 30, 50 years are going to be pretty alarming in lots of ways. There's a lot that's going to happen, and a lot of that's going to be really tough in lots of ways. But I do think that change is already happening. It will continue to happen, and that will kind of get us through. And the other thing I'd say is that at the end of the day, the only way to get out of this is to build a world that's actually fairer and juster and more sustainable. And that's what we're going to have to do. And so in a weird kind of way, the end point of this is actually something better. Does that make sense? If we can get through this, what comes out the other end is actually better. And that's something to focus on, that kind of connection of the solution to this is actually, more equality, more justice, less consumption, and more sustainability. And those are all really fantastic things. A world based on those principles is going to be a better world than the one we live in now.
Thank you so much, James.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, I hope that was okay. Sorry.
Fascinating. No, thank you. Great interview. Thank you, Steffi and Hannah.
They're great questions. Thank you very much.